Welcome to the Compliance Trestle Issue Review. Today is October 30th. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and will be shared publicly on our YouTube channel to promote transparency and accountability. Your participation in these meetings is an agreement to abide by the OSCAL-Compass Code of Conduct, which can be found in the community repository. All right, let's get started. Go down to today's date. Before we go into any new issues, I see, Chris, you had added a note there about setup config. Did you want to talk about that for a sec?
We can talk about that in the context of the draft PR. Might be worthwhile as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Here, we can go to PRs first then.
So I think there are two which I want to talk about, if that's okay. Let's talk about 1711.
Cool.
Okay, so this is trying to back out some of the bad decisions we made early on in terms of not really bad decisions, but suboptimal decisions we made early on in terms of the documentation. Effectively, make docs. The ideal way of using make docs is where you don't have to use the paths. So you don't have to use the nav construct. Now, in our case, we have to use nav construct sometimes. But if you use the nav construct, it encourages bad behavior because people basically mismatch the relative path in the documentation compared with the structure, and you end up with this bit of a mess. So that's what this PR does, is a whole pile of work there, as well as social previews and descriptions for FCO and flav icons. So it's that big documentation PR. So it's basically epic. That's working through some of the issues here. So I think we really want to do this as soon, from my perspective, because this impacts every time someone adds or removes a file. I think we want to do this, have a look at this PR sooner rather than later. So if you could have a look, it would be appreciated at some stage. So that's this PR. So that one's only documentation. But it does touch a lot of files, because basically every file in documentation is touched, because I added a description on each of the files and changed a lot of the paths, because the SEO is affected by how easy it is for someone to basically read the path. So Lou, there's a few areas in yours in particular with the tasks. I basically restructured it so tasks were their own subdirectory to make it so that the title of the file, just imagine if you read the URL, you want to be able to read the title of the file. So the biggest change though is the Trestle API SDKs were all flattened out. But effectively, I made it so those Trestle SDKs are actually readable all the way through. So if you have a look down in reference API SDKs, you can see they basically contain a directory structure. Initially, we decided against this because it has some unusual concept, because it was high risk that files would be missed. But the way in which we have commit messages now, you can't have the missing files because the validation will fail anyway. So it basically re-nested the files, because it'll give you better a better way for make docs to work, and therefore, and also for Google search to look at it. So if you go down to say one of these files, which has got go right down a little bit further, left hand side.
Go down, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
You just give you an example. Say the common types, say or CLI, the bottom one.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah. So these ones, they're basically moved around a little bit, but it also adds a short description string. We can mess with what the description strings are, but that's more important when we're doing things like blogs, because it means that because that becomes a social preview. So we can maybe do a little bit more inference on this, but it's a first pass. We could do another round of SEO, but in reality, is the website is not looked at a huge amount. But this is just hopefully will help a little bit to bump it up. So Jen, I think there was an issue in the community one around multiple tools. So the biggest question I think we have it with to the issue you raised. Is how do we want to deal with multiple, like the website across multiple projects? Do we want to force a roll up or not? And if we force a roll up, do we want to do that with a consistent tool or not? So that was one question I did have, but that was this issue.
Yeah.
Not sure.
And you brought up a good point, because if we used Jekyll, we would have to, and we wanted to do a bit more, we would have to install Ruby and install the bundler locally. And I did do that to preview the site. I have a little bit of familiarity with Hugo. So I in another open source project, I've kind of been involved with this before, and I'm trying to remember how we handled it, but I thought it was Git submodules.
Yeah. You can do all sorts of creative stuff, because in the end, all the tools do is they render out HTML. It's just about whether the menuing carries across the sites. Or the other way you can do this, of course, is you can use subdomains. Because if we own our own domain, then we've got a lot more flexibility. So I think that's another question that we need to just sort out with the broader team. And I won't say the domain name now because we're putting this on YouTube.
Yeah, it's perhaps it's something that can be discussed on that issue in the community repo, and then maybe we could talk about it at the next oversight committee meeting to see if there's opinions about that, because that was kind of the reason I stopped where I stopped with the Jekyll implementation, is because I was like, oh, I should probably check that we want to actually use this site generator. So
yeah, and it's the same with this one. This one's a little bit more coupled up because there's a pile of junk that we're doing in there now already with the Python module expansion. Originally, I had it on the issues to remove the module expansion, but then I realized that we might actually want to use it eventually to mark what SDKs are used, or what parts are actually in the SDK. So I haven't made any implication in this. All I've done is convert what we had, which was every Python class comes, or every Python module comes across. So we do just need to think about how that might work eventually.
gotcha. I think we can add this to the next milestone, just so it actually does have a conflict.
Yeah, I can fix that. We just need to know, because every time someone generates a new file, I'm going to have a conflict to unbundle. So it's just a staging concern.
I gotcha. Okay, I'm going to add it just so we can make sure it gets looked at. Okay. Anything more on this one, or did you want me to switch to the other PR?
No, switch to the other PR because it's a bigger one.
Okay.
Or it has more implications.
This one?
Yeah. Okay. So I had a good look at. So one of the ones which we had in the background was, and I added an issue for this, but it was really around how do we modernize the tooling for the build tooling for Trestle eventually. And that means how you manage packages and all of the pieces underneath. So the linters and other bits and pieces. So the short version of the story is, historically this was pretty messy in Python. It's improving, but it's not great yet. So what there is a convergence on PyProject.toml as the way of configuring projects and builds. So that's good. So the objective would be get rid of setup.config, get rid of setup.py, hopefully get rid of some of the other configurations like pre-commit config and the pre-commit config and a few other bits and pieces, and just converge on PyProject.toml. So that would be like the first pass. The second, so that's the way in which I looked at this. There's multiple tools which you can do this, but there's one which has been sponsored by the Python Packaging Authority, which is called Hatch. That seems to have some pretty decent. I would say it's well funded, and there's a couple of things which we're using right now, which are like they haven't been touched in years. So if we have an issue, that could be a problem. So that was the first tier of that. The second tier effectively was what we need to decide is whether I'd say that should be non-destructive from an end user perspective. The only thing it would do is decrease the number of dependencies that we have, unless they are doing a build, as in a development build. What I did need to check though is, are we interested? This is like more of a long-running question. Is we get better efficiency if we consolidate down on some of the Hatch, some of the linting tools as well. So effectively, there's to go along with Hatch, there's another tool which is called, I'm going to miss the tool name now. Let me. I'm going to miss the name of the tool. Hatch as docs. Sorry for taking time, but
Yeah, no worries.
Lint. Configuration. Here we go. That was it. Hatch has a kind of corresponding tool for static analysis. This is just like, when I say static analysis, I mainly mean linting and formatting, called Rough, which is designed to be a superset of some of the other tools. So effectively, just think of it like a 10-to-1 compression on some of the other tools that we have. The question, of course, is if we do Rough, if we want to add Rough, there's two ways of doing that, because Rough has an expansive set of an expanded set of linting kind of controls. If you scroll all the way down the bottom, if I use the default config, it should be in the comments down the bottom. Why is it? Oh, that's annoying. I'll add the comment in there.
Okay.
Basically, there's a very large number of linting failures if I put the default config in for the linter moving forward. So the way in which I was kind of viewing this was, if we want to do this, the most desirable way of doing this would be to move to the new linter, but add all the linting exceptions, and then add a set of like a low priority issue on moving to what effectively is some kind of something which approximates the modern defaults of Python, linting and structuring. And we just basically progressively eliminate those over time when people have, some cycles. It would not be high priority, but we basically say, look, we don't want to add any more, and the objective is to add less, and we can kind of remove them over time. So that was the way in which I was thinking about it. But at the same time, I think there was like something like a couple of thousand line items by default. A lot of them could be changed automatically, because it was just like a lot of them were trivial ones around the fact that the versions of Python that we are supporting allow us some modernized approaches to how we use types. So at the moment we often use typing.list, but you can just use the Python list keyword now for typing. So I'll just bring it out that effectively it's, do we want to also look at the linting at the same time, and gradually, progressively in the background do that, or we just I can move to Hatch, which is moves everything to PyProject.toml, but we leave the linting completely aside to start with. Not move to Rough, basically.
So I know I'm somewhat familiar with Hatch. I've never used it personally. I'm mostly familiar with poetry. Not saying that I have an aversion to using Hatch though. I might for me, I might have to think about it a bit more.
Yeah, I think it does require thinking and maybe a slightly larger group for discussion. I don't know why the comment did not hit there. There should be a comment on it. Maybe I put it in the issue, but I think the Hatch versus poetry is also a valid discussion, and that's why I kind of stopped. Again, I realized there was a pile. I was kind of experimenting, and I realized that there was a pile of work. But the reason why I didn't look at poetry initially is poetry seems like it's optimized for a service where you have explicit version pinning. And I was trying to avoid anything that had a version lock file on it, because as a SDK dependency, I think the objective probably is to have the widest set of dependency matching that we possibly can, which is something we've talked about separately.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I completely agree with that. The version pinning has actually caused downstream issues in my project. So I would really like to avoid doing that.
Yeah, and I can talk more about that if we go back to the issues at some point as well, because that was kind of where this spiraled from in my mind.
Yeah, let's take a look at new issues. I don't know if this one, I think it might still be in the new status, because I believe that we might not have submitted it yet. Let's see. Is this the issue
I think
about
it's
fuzzing?
Yeah. It'd be
Okay.
worthwhile having a quick discussion about it if we have a little bit second of time.
Yeah.
So I don't get to all of these. The way in which I read the fuzzing, the way in which I read the description on fuzzing is, look, it's possible, but to do this properly, we probably need to. It would probably make sense to do that in the context of after making some bets on what we want to use for PyProject.toml. We might be able to get away with some of this with I think doing it in the context of poetry or Hatch would make a lot of sense. I'll put it that way, because effectively you'd have an external script which is basically doing some brute force fuzzing, which means downloading and creating environments, which is not easy to do today with setup.py.
So I'm a little bit new. Fuzzing means there's a set of versions that are acceptable, not just one kind of a thing. Or
yeah, effectively the objective would be to say, okay, for all the dependencies that we have, what's the actual flaw before the tests start to fail? Then we put that actual flaw in, and then we rely on Dependapot to make sure that we meet that if there is a security issue with any of those dependencies, that it will update the minimum version for a dependency or an associated tool. But just think about it like, for our runtime documentation, is Pydantic to 0 our actual dependency, or is it 1.9? At the moment, we don't actually know. There's a whole lot of dependencies, which I would argue we probably have at minimums, but we're not actually articulating what those are. We're just relying on the fact that the Python package manager downloads the most recent version.
okay, so in the end, what this is giving is the opportunity to use more than one version to run your Trestle of dependencies.
Yeah. So I think that the corner that we've got backed into is that it looks like where we've had security vulnerabilities before, it appears that there's been some behavior where there's been what we've lost track of is some of the version dependencies have been pinned. Some of the versions have been pinned historically because there was issues, like explicitly pinned, like exactly pinned if you go to setup.config. So some of them have been pinned because there is a actual issue. Some of them have been pinned because that was the way someone articulated that the security requirements to enforce being above a particular version, where you might actually have wanted to say, instead of saying cryptography equals 4204, you might want to say cryptography must be greater than version 42. Or 03 or 02, and that's where there's a bit of an issue. So at least for those top dependencies, I think it would be worthwhile basically running through a battery over those top dependencies to understand what our actual dependency limits are. For the dev ones, then we probably also need to do it for the dev ones as well. Some of the dev ones as well. Like that PyTest version is quite old right now.
But I mean, ideally, you want to run with the current version, and the only reason you wouldn't run with the current version is because somehow you haven't upgraded your code to be able to deal with whatever's changed, right? I mean, why would you want to run with something old if you didn't have to?
Well, I think the question is, as an SDK, we want to provide flexibility where possible. And I 100% agree. You would probably want to run by default with the latest version, but even just think of it like we want to provide as much flexibility as possible to end users without costing us anything, but we want to be able to articulate.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not saying so what I want to be clear about is we're not going to change our code right now to expand the versions.
Yeah, I mean, just looking here, I mean, all of these seem fine to me except for, URL live equals something. I mean, that seems like a
it's the ones
a
up
red flag, but everything else says, give me something modern, and I'm okay with that, right? So
yes, so the ones which are a bit of a problem is Parameko, cryptography, probably Ginger as well. These ones are where we've got a few of the problems. Now, the ones here, it might be narrow enough that we could do some brute forcing on, but it does help articulate what our actual requirements are a little bit better. And when I say brute forcing, I mean someone sitting there twiddling the numbers until they understand what the minimum is, doing a bisection.
Yeah. So again, okay, I understand. It's fine.
Yeah. The other one that it did bring up is ILCLI, which is a tool which we use because it was built by some people at IBM. That thing has not had much love. So in terms of if we have any issues fixing it, we might want to have a look at that one and see whether that has any risk.
I missed that. Which one was that?
ILCLI number 30.
Okay. Yeah.
It's like maybe that's had one commit in the past 2 years. So might be something for us to think about in the future. I don't think it's high risk based on what it's doing, but it's just yeah.
We that's a good point, is that we probably should review all the things that we're using and decide what we want to use and what we don't want to use. I mean, the data model code generator is also a thing that is
that was kind of where I was going but moving from ILCLI data model code generator is a piece of it is quite a bit of effort. So actually data model code generator, I don't think that should even be in an install requires. It actually should be a dev requires task, because it doesn't actually get used at runtime as well.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few things like that. We basically just, if we want to optimize it, but effectively, I think we should make a decision on Hatch or Poetry or a modernized, approach. Once we do that, then we can do it to, we can start iterating on this, because whatever decision we make on a build system, that will have impacts on the development tooling and how we can compress the dependency list. Compressing the dependency list is probably going to make more of a difference than anything we just said, because it'll literally get rid of things and therefore not mean that you don't need to worry about any of these versions at all.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Sorry, that was long-winded, but
No,
I
think it's a good discussion. I think that our dependencies are our weakness, and so we should be careful of what we're using.
Yeah. And that was a long way of saying that was half a flight over to India. I did get to meet Vikas though, so that was fun.
Oh, cool! I've worked with him for 4 years. I've never seen him in person. So.
Okay,
So then,
I'm good. Yeah. So I think that the outcome of that is I will go back and try and add some details on Hatch as a tool, and see if we can break down the issue a bit further till we get to something concrete, which is deliverable, or whether we want to look at Poetry, so we can look at that in the next issue review. And then this one will have to get bumped out, because I think it makes a lot more sense to do that fuzzing after you've made a decision on the modernized tool chain. I'll work for no reason.
yeah, it sounds like we might even need an epic to capture all of these requirements that we just talked about.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack at making an epic to describe it.
Yeah, maybe that would be a good place to start talking about Hatch versus Poetry too.
Yeah. Yeah, but Poetry was probably the other big one which came up in my list as well, having a good look around.
Sounds good.
All right. Here, let's just move to some of the new issues.
Doing a little backpedaling on the previous issue. So
Sure.
I actually started looking at that some time ago, and there was a lot of changes. So I'm not sure how to proceed on that. I mean, should I just bring up the website and see if it looks pretty good and say okay? Or, I mean, what kind of feedback are you looking for?
I think maybe bring up the website, see if you can build it locally. If you think it looks okay, then I think it would be, I think there is a bit of a trust me, some of the stuff will be improved. Then, I mean, the biggest one I would say is, do you like the idea of not having to enter the metadata into the nav ever again for most of your use cases? And if the answer to that is yes, then there's a benefit to the work that I did.
Yeah, I mean, certainly having to manage something manually is, taking the human out of the equation is usually always a good idea. So,
yeah,
in theory, I'm in favor. So
yeah, but yeah, have a look. And if it looks all good, if you can build it locally and it looks all good, because obviously I only built it on my workstation, then that would be a good first pass,
okay.
Testing it. Yeah.
That's what I'll
do. You will need to download new developer extensions, and I think the question from a version issue is, does adding new developer extensions, is that a new feature, or is that just a fix because developer environment, we don't count the developer environment when we do the build when we do version increments?
All right, I'll try and give it a shot soon, and if I have any issues, I'll complain. So
thank you.
Yep.
All right. I think we can take a look. I think these have kind of been in the new status for a while. Perhaps we could move them to blocked, but I don't know that we need to go over them now. But one I did want to go over is the container build. Chris, I did kind of talk about this at the community meeting and just shared it, looking for community feedback, because there are a lot of downstream projects that are building Trestle in a container. So I figured we could talk about this one a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the root one for me is, should we be building a container? If we build a container, then we also have some of these issues around dependencies that we want to manage. So, I mean, in some ways it's the opposite, because we will effectively pin things in the container, but at least then we'll be carrying an entire environment through, which is working. I did also, so it's like, what do we want to do around base containers? Obviously, given our heritage, we probably want to start with a UB container. Then the question was Docker Hub versus not. I did notice that the only reason why I suggested Quay originally was because one of the things I would like to, I think it'd be good for the project to spend a little bit more time on is understanding how people are using the product. Quay might have given us some extra. I thought it might have given us some extra access to analytics, but it turns out I think there's some alternate CNCF services in terms of understanding how things have been used and downloaded as well. So if we should have a look at, I'll put some extra notes on there, but we should have a look at that. But I think it just makes sense. And then the question is, if we build it, then we need to figure out, what are we going to use for signing and all of these kind of bits and pieces. I'm assuming we're just going to use GitHub Actions, perhaps with Cosign or some other the upstream tools in the context of what we're doing here right now. I'm not sure what your thoughts were, Jen.
Yeah, that's what I'm using. I'm using keyless signing with GitHub Actions and Cosign downstream. So perhaps we could just take the same approach, since we already have that working downstream, and happy to kind of bring that approach upstream. So you did mention like the dependency issue here, because then we'll have dependencies. And this is kind of originally when I was talking about like having the SDK with the CLI, I think this is where we find that friction is use cases like this.
So I think this is probably the meta one that this might be actually, it might completely invalidate the discussion we just had before on fuzzing, which is, if we say people consume it via the container and that's the default interface that we think people are going to consume it by in the future, then we can completely forget the fuzzing. We can just pin the issues and say, this is the container build that we have, and we're making sure that the container build doesn't have any vulnerabilities, which is the actual request. Now, I would definitely want support from the IBM people who I know have already got a container build, as well as Jen, before we go somewhere that radical. But maybe to start with, we build a container and we basically build with latest, which should be no issues as long as we're building the container relatively frequently. Then we shouldn't have too many issues, but it will force a lot of minor version bumps for us. Well, I guess there's a question of how we build how we do container image builds versus Trestle builds as well. So we might just have to flush that out, because if we're doing one container image build per Trestle build, that will force us it'll basically force us into the opposite position, which is we change the dependency, the minimum dependency versions all the time, pretty rapidly.
So I confess that I'm container challenged. And what does this really mean? Does this mean that we build a container and it gets pushed as a separate entity to some container repository, or is it also part of PyPy? I mean, no. Also, if I'm going to write, so for example, some things that I do now is that I use Trestle, if you will, as an SDK, and I build some specialized Python code on top of it to do special things. So does that mean that I can use the container and reach in and use Python, or do I still want to be able to access, PyPy and get my libraries that way?
I would say this would be an additional distribution method for us. So if we make the assumption that let's divide the use cases into broadly into two use cases. Trestle is a CLI. So Trestle is a tool which is driven from a CLI, and Trestle is a tool which is driven from a via some kind of remote network connection, aka a REST API, quite frequently. And it could be orchestrated remotely as well. When it's orchestrated remotely, then I think the implication is that environment is very much container friendly. So if your use case was I want to have some remote widget call my arbitrary Python code which sits on top of Trestle, then you might build a container which contains the arbitrary Python code to execute your outcome and send your results on to the next stage. If you're using it on the CLI, then including your extra code, then you're probably using it stay exactly like we are with PyPy. You can kind of hack around using containers on the CLI, but I would say it's probably something that would have more limited use cases. The reason why I think Jen and I were interested in maybe having that as an option for also use on the CLI is there are a number of environments where containers represent a single object that gets imported into the environment. And Trestle as a Python package would be importing the object and all of the individual dependencies. And while all of that comes in the container, there's a perception issue. So I think for your command line tools, it probably wouldn't change. This is more for, say, I think Jen's project where they're already building a container for TrestleBot from memory.
So the container is, here's Trestle in a black box, and I don't want to touch it. I just want to use it, essentially.
Yeah, or here's Trestle in a black box. I don't want to change its code, but I'm going to layer some more code on top of it. But but in that case, it's really, do I call the code through the interfaces of the container management system? So in the case of running Trestle as a GitHub Actions pipeline, you can easily call, say, I want to do this in the context of a container, which makes it a little bit easier to ship things around. So in that case, it's, I don't want to have to download and install Trestle every time. I just want to say, please use this container and then run Trestle. Or in the context of using it inside of OpenShift as an example, it would be, please, here is my REST API code which is running. It needs Trestle and all of the Python dependencies, and then it runs Flask. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, I mean, if we, for example, wanted to work with Tecton, it would make that, it would simplify that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good long-term use case as well from, I guess, where Jen and I live, at least.
Yeah, so, I mean, a container seems like a nice thing, if it makes people's lives simpler, it seems like a good thing. I just am unsure is if we need to support container and the current way of doing business, or just containers only. I don't, that's not clear.
I think at the moment we need to support containers plus. I don't think, because otherwise it'd be a breaking change to every workflow that exists today.
Okay. I'm not so against breaking changes if it's a better way of doing business, but I mean, if it's putting an undue encumbrance upon me by having to go through a container, then I'm going to be unhappy. Is my concern.
I think if you're I think it would be at this stage. I don't think there's a clean way of doing it. If you're using Trestle on the CLI on your local workstation, it would be an undue encumbrance.
Okay. Then,
so, yeah, it definitely would be. It'd be significant behavior change.
Yeah. Well, at least to start, I would say that we'd have both, and we'll see what happens from there forward, right? So.
Yeah, and that's where I think if we can do this with I think that the roundabout way of saying if we can do this where we can at least make sure that we get a decent set of download stats and understand behavior to some degree, then that would be useful for us, so that we could understand, effectively over a year style horizon, where do we think that we want to put the effort in terms of Trestle?
Yeah, I would guess that again that a vast majority of people would like a container as opposed to all the other nonsense. But
yeah, hopefully, definitely makes it easier to ship
Right.
for us.
So on this topic, do either of you see any reason not to move this to the ready status? Is there anything that we need to figure out first before this is ready to actually be worked on? It sounds like we were still kind of going back and forth about maybe where to publish to, what base image to use.
I think the where to publish to and what base image are the big one. I don't mind too much. I was looking at the CNCF project tools. If CNCF say Docker Hub, then I think that's fine for CNCF project tools. Let's have a quick look. I think the one that I found, I think it was, there's definitely a tool that we can use for some of the analytics, which is the biggest reason to use Clay. If there's, I think I'll just add a comment. And I think I'm happy with Docker Hub. I think the only question is then what the base image would be.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm also happy to leave the base image up to the implementer and then have it maybe talked about on a PR if it's not too disruptive.
I don't think it should be. I think that's probably a reasonable way of dealing with it.
Okay, yeah. Sounds good. Okay, then I think we can move this into the ready status. All right, any more discussion on this before we move to the next one? All right, moving on. This one, Chris. This looks new.
Yeah, sorry, my computer's having there we go. Okay, I think this was just one that I think this is probably backlog and pretty low down. But I was kind of having a bit of a poke around the code, and because I was writing kind of messing with the documentation, I was having a poke around the code, and effectively Trestle tasks allow you to do almost whatever you want. From a transformation, really it's just Trestle running an arbitrary piece of code. It does limit how you can have input configuration, primarily to some configuration files, but the tasks are there, so they're discrete kind of workflows which you can run. The other original idea was these Trestle transforms, and the idea behind transforms was potentially they could be chainable, but they haven't been built out that well. So I was effectively kind of thinking about we should put in the back of our mind do we all want to have a look at this code, understand what we're doing? If the Trestle transforms aren't going to be used, or we think it's too complex an interface, I think that back to the question of what's in the SDK, I think we could just basically rationalize some of the code on the simpler form of tasks. Or if we think that there's some investment, then maybe have a look at the tasks and rationalize them long term onto the transforms. That was effectively the thought that I had there when I had a look at it. Lou, this is the area you've been touching this quite a bit in terms of building the tasks. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, again, this was kind of evolutionary, and so the way I started was using tasks, as you say, because they could do anything, and it's not clear that some of the things that I did shouldn't have been transforms instead of tasks, but As far as I know, transforms are not well used and tasks are, around. And so just by virtue of what's there is what's there. And so if transforms aren't being used, I would say that, unless there's a demand from somebody to say we have to have them, I would say we can kind of sunset them and just stay with tasks for now. And if in the future somebody does want to link things together in a transforming kind of way, then we'll revitalize it.
Yeah, so I think that was just really the thought of, do we want to use it? It was kind of a stimulus for discussion of what should be in the SDK. And potentially a point where we might want to put a boundary on what goes into the SDK moving forward.
Yeah, and so again, I would agree that transforms are not well utilized right now, and so why support something that is not being used until such time that somebody wants it? Then we'll reconsider.
Could we talk through maybe an example use case for a transform? I actually use the XCCDF transform right now downstream in a prototype.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering, like, what could these potential use cases be? Because maybe they could be used to reduce some of the duplication in the tasks, if there is any.
Yes. So I think the one that I was thinking about when I was doing some of the original kind of conceptualization was the transform example that really kind of came to the top of my mind was things like, I have a set of component definitions. What I want to do is basically define an aggregation operation, which is I want to convert this into a flat component which contains all the information about all of these components in a particular way. So these kind of basically object level kind of, it's not merge in the sense of the original kind of CLI behavior merging, which is also probably not used that well, but it was more, how do we start to do state transform, like basically state changes as you go run through the pipeline. So if you think about a large set of project might have many components, those components might be maintained independently, but you convert into the products. The products, you basically want to flatten out some of the information. So that would be one. The other one would be, I want to take all of these things, component definitions, and add all that information into a system security plan. That was another thing that I thought in terms of OSCAL to OSCAL. Then, of course, when you get to the assessment results, I was thinking about it as in, I guess think of it as primarily the large classes that really effectively are OSCAL to OSCAL, which might have various permutations of multiple in, multiple out, multiple in, single out, single out, single in, multiple out. And then there's, external into OSCAL and OSCAL to external format. That was kind of the way in which I was trying to articulate the workflow, with the possibility they could be chained. Now, maybe the complicated part about this is we don't think we're actually going to chain it, and that each one would just be something that a user would orchestrate externally, in which case we could probably simplify down some of the APIs, because I'm pretty sure from memory the transformation interface allows you to do some chaining of transforms, which is where things probably get a little bit complicated from a workflow perspective.
Yeah, I don't see a use case, at least for me personally, for chaining, but something that would be helpful to me in general would be even skipping the SSP, if that's even possible. Or let me expand a little bit. If I had a set of components, could I just get an assessment plan from that? That might be something that I would find helpful.
Yeah, and see that's kind of like that skip operation is effectively the way in which I would think about a transform, which is Trestle is going to provide some opinionation on doing a task which might not be quote unquote by the books. Well, I mean, once you get to the point of doing kind of the aggregation operations, I don't think OSCAL doesn't provide you with enough information about what you're meant to do. I mean, profile resolution is the one kind of aggregation operation, which is really, really clear in terms of what you're meant to do. And then from the profile, what should be in the system security plan to meet that profile is also very clear. But that's only a subset of information in the system security plan. So I think those were the kind of ideas, but maybe we should have I think it'd be worthwhile having a bit of a look on the SDK and maybe kind of making some, maybe it's worthwhile kind of spinning off a separate discussion about that at some point in time, once we've had a few people have had a read through some of the chunks of code and see whether we could, evolve what we're doing. I mean, it's very much tech. It's very much a how do we do things better rather than how do we do more. But I think when I was looking at it, it kind of struck me that we're definitely kind of not consistent to an end user.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually kind of a topic upstream in the cloud native OSCAL project, which used to be called OSCAL norms, if you're familiar with that one. Where we're talking about we know what's in the OSCAL documents, but we don't know when to transfer what where, if that makes sense. Like you could kind of understand, like when you're aggregating component definitions, where everything goes in the SSP. But like you said, it's not super prescriptive. So you could potentially have two tools do it completely differently. And so that's one of the topics of discussion.
Yeah, so it's effectively the way in which I would view, now maybe another way of articulating this is, it is one of these interfaces, I think there's three classes of interfaces, ones which are clearly defined by, ones which are absolutely clearly defined by OSCAL. So I think profile resolution is the one which is clearly defined by OSCAL. Ones which Trestle is trying to set some norms to be used and pseudo standardized on, which we might want to create relatively generic behavior, and ones which involve particular external third-party tools and esoteric behavior which is unique to those third-party tools. I think that would be the three tiers which I think we would want to kind of assess this by.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm wondering, I don't know that we could move this into the ready status. It might be something it sounds like something that should be socialized with a larger group like we talked about before. So
I think I would just suggest that we ask for some volunteers and assign it to people to kind of come back with a recommendation, maybe some kind of recommendation.
yeah.
Maybe we need a couple of people. I mean, look, I'm happy to see how I can take part. I mean, I think Lou, sorry to volunteer you, but you've been writing a lot of these. You probably should take part. We probably need some external participation as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've in the task area, I'm quite fluent, but in the transform area, I'm not. So
yeah, I think mainly your voice in terms of what's in the tasks today would be enough to start with.
This would also be helpful, I think, from a collaboration standpoint on the Go version of the SDK, which I think will probably start adding things to that in the near term. But just understanding if the transformations, the OSCAL to OSCAL transformations are going to be something that's supported by the core SDK, what transformations do we want to include and how should they be done consistently throughout the language SDKs? So I did want to bring that up. And I might be volunteering myself, but that's okay.
yeah, I'm in favor of doing it the same everywhere. So that much we're in agreement. So
yeah, I think that was kind of the point which was knocking around my head when I was thinking about this.
Okay, it might be an issue that I open on the Go SDK just to review the transforms here in what's available in Python and maybe do some experimentation over there.
Yep. Sounds good.
All right. I'm going to leave this in new so we can talk about it maybe in a wider audience on the next one. But we do have 2 minutes left, and I have a hard stop in 2 minutes. So I just wanted to kind of ask, is there anything else that you guys want to talk about quickly, or do you think we're good to wrap up for the day?
The ginger one I think is kind of self-explanatory, but the only other one I wanted to comment was 5 there. That is effectively bundled into my hatch testing anyway, because I was doing the testing on a plane. Effectively the question is, for testing, we've made the assumption with compliance Trestle that you have internet connectivity for testing, as in some of our tests are integration tests at the moment. If that's okay, I'm all good. I just put a flag into the build process so that you can override that if you have local only tests. But I think if we're developing on GitHub, I think we can assume that you can reach github.com when you're running the tests. Because that's where some of the content is coming from. It's coming from like the OSCAL Pro. It's the 853 files have been resolved to raw.githubusers.com at the moment, and then pulled down when you do run the test suite.
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with that because the changes there have actually caused the test to break in the past.
I think basically it's a question of, do we want to go through the act of mocking the downloads in all use cases, which would be potentially the ideal way of doing it, excluding say one test which actually downloads stuff from the internet, or are we happy the way in which it acts, and we just put a flag in there if it has to reach out to the internet? So if people need to run it in an isolated environment, they can run it in an isolated environment, and that kind of gives us an indication of how many tests are affected by external third-party content.
Yeah. Or now that we have our own content repo, I wonder if it would make sense to start reaching and using our own content. But that might be another discussion. And I can send that, Chris, that's a pretty brand new repo. So it might be something I can send.
Is that the ProdSec one?
No, there's a content repo in OSCAL-Compass now.
Okay. Just put the comments on it. There's a partial implementation. I think the partial implementation still makes sense to be there, but the bigger question is, do we accept that as a completion, or do we want to add some extra work to do either of these replatformings, either our content repo or mocking?
All right, cool. And so I'll leave this one in new then, so we can talk about it a little bit more. But I got to drop. Thank you both for joining.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.